Welcome back, focused learners. Today, we're cracking open a massive historical cold case file. We are investigating one of France's most famous, most enduring mysteries of all time. We're going to sift through centuries of wild rumors, political propaganda, and straight-up Hollywood myths to get to the absolute historical truth. Because, as you'll see in this explainer, reality is often just as fascinating as fiction, if not literally more so.
Okay, let's dive into this. Who was the true prisoner? I mean, for centuries, this one central question has completely baffled historians, writers, and, well, just the general public alike. We've got this anonymous man, right, locked away in the most secure fortresses in all of France, and it's strictly by the express orders of King Louis XIV himself. His identity? Completely unknown. His face? Hidden away. So you have to ask yourself, who on earth was important enough to be imprisoned with such extreme, almost paranoid secrecy, but somehow not important enough to just simply be executed?
Section 1. The Mysterious Prisoner. To really wrap our heads around this, we need to transport ourselves back to 1680s France, the era of the Sun King. This was a time of absolute monarchy, where crossing the crown basically meant you entirely vanished from society. Poof, gone. And during this decade, these really strange rumors started swirling across the country about a faceless man, this shadow moving between prisons, heavily guarded and completely silenced. Let's move to and see how this builds. When we actually track the verified historical movements of this captive, a genuinely chilling pattern emerges. Starting in the late 1660s and right through the 80s, he was held in the harsh alpine fortresses of Pignerol and Ixelles. Then, in 1687, a gazette explicitly mentions his transfer to the island citadel of St. Margaret. And finally, in 1698, he's moved to the infamous Bastille in Paris. Now, throughout this entire timeline, the whole shebang, he was under the strict, unending custody of exactly one man, a former musketeer named Benenigue de Saint-Mars. This wasn't just your standard imprisonment, this was essentially a living death. We know from accounts of other prisoners at Pignerol that Saint-Mars enforced conditions of total, absolute isolation. No visits, no contact, no books, nothing. And this absolute secrecy, it extended right to his very end. In 1703, the prisoner finally died at the Bastille. According to the official records, he was around 50 years old and was hastily buried in the St. Paul Cemetery under a completely fake name. But, get this, it didn't stop there. A massive, almost panicked cover-up immediately kicked into gear. His clothes, his belongings, all burned at dawn. They even went so far as to completely scrape down and whitewash the actual walls of his cell, just to ensure he left absolutely zero trace behind. It's wild. Section 2. Theories and political propaganda. So how does an isolated, unnamed prisoner suddenly become the center of these massive international conspiracy theories? Well, human nature, right? When you create a vacuum of information, people will absolutely rush to fill it. After his death, the story of this mysterious captive just took on a life of its own. It transformed from this grim reality of the French penal system into a highly effective political weapon. During the 9 Years' War, the Dutch Republic was fighting desperately against French expansion. And looking for literally any advantage, Dutch agents actually weaponized these rumors. They started spreading heavy anti-Louis XIV propaganda, claiming that the mysterious masked prisoner was actually a former lover of the Queen Mother and was in fact the true biological father of the king. Think about that. If people believed this, it would make Louis XIV entirely illegitimate. Almost overnight, the masked man wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was a crucial strategic piece on a geopolitical chessboard. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer creativity of the French public's imagination when it came to guessing who was actually behind the mask. Let's just run through this suspect lineup real quick because it's fascinating. First, you had Louis de Bourbon, the king's own son who was banished for his homosexuality and died in battle. Or, did he? Theorists claimed his death was completely faked and his father secretly locked him up. Then you had the Duke of Bordeaux, a cousin to the king and a former rebel leader who also supposedly died in battle. And then, and this one is my personal favorite just for its sheer absurdity, Nabo. Nabo was a pygmy page who, according to these wild pamphlets going around, had allegedly impregnated the king's wife. I mean, the theories were just getting increasingly bizarre. Section 3. Voltaire's invention. But the narrative didn't truly explode into the myth we all know today until the Enlightenment era, and we have one of history's most famous thinkers to thank for that. Voltaire. Now, interestingly enough, Voltaire himself was imprisoned in the Bastille back in 1717, which is where he claimed to have heard stories of the masked prisoner from some of the older inmates. But Voltaire didn't just passively report the rumors. Oh no, he drastically rewrote them. Just look at this quote directly from his writings. He claimed, "The chin was composed of steel springs, allowing him to eat with it on." Now, notice the very specific detail here. Earlier historical sources, they only ever mentioned a mask made of cloth or velvet. It was Voltaire who literally invented the iron aspect of the mask. For Enlightenment thinkers, this cruel mechanical torture device was just the perfect metaphor for the oppression and tyranny of the absolute monarchy. And he didn't stop at the iron mask. Voltaire completely elevated the prisoner's status. He heavily embellished the accounts, describing the captive as a young man of majestic stature and noble figure. He went on to claim the prisoner had these incredibly refined manners, was served exquisite food, and basically passed the time playing the guitar, receiving visits only from the prison governor. With just a few strokes of his pen, Voltaire successfully transformed a faceless, suffering captive into a tragic, noble prince. It was a brilliant political symbol. Section 4. From Dumas to Hollywood. Moving into the 19th century, we see this political propaganda take its final leap into absolute pop culture fiction. What started out as a real, documented historical event and then morphed into Enlightenment philosophy was about to become the ultimate adventure story. Enter Alexandre Dumas, the legendary French novelist. You know, the guy famous for the Three Musketeers. Well, between 1847 and 1850, Dumas published The Viscount of Bragelonne, which was the final installment of his Musketeer saga. Dumas basically took Voltaire's beautifully embellished accounts and used them as the ultimate, dramatic finale for his characters, which permanently cemented the legend into the public consciousness. And what exactly was Dumas's grand invention? He proposed that the prisoner was none other than Philippe, the older twin brother of King Louis XIV, a man whose very existence threatened the legitimacy of the throne. It's an incredibly compelling narrative, right? A royal twin robbed of his birthright. Honestly, it was so good that 20th century Hollywood movies picked it up and just ran with it, basically turning Dumas's fiction into what so many people today mistakenly accept as universal truth. Section 5. The True Identity. But hey, this is an explainer grounded in facts, so let's peel back this final layer of the onion, leave the Hollywood scripts behind for a minute, and look at the actual historical evidence to finally solve this cold case. And this brilliantly illustrates the divide between the myth we've inherited and the actual historical reality. The myth gives us this heavy iron mask, a royal twin brother, and permanent agonizing torture. But the reality? Historians actually agree the mask was simply made of black velvet. It was a super common accessory for aristocratic women of the time, mostly used for sun protection. Plus, the prisoner likely had pretty humble origins, and crucially, this is key, experts believe he didn't even wear the mask in his cell at all. He only wore it during prison transfers to keep his identity hidden from the public. So it's a much more mundane reality, but still a fascinating operational security measure for the 17th century. So who was he really? Well, some modern historians have pointed to Nicolas Fouquet, the incredibly powerful superintendent of finances who was jailed for treason and corruption. And he was indeed held at the Pignerol fortress by our infamous guard, Saint Mars. So it sounds like a plausible theory, right? But it actually falls apart completely on the timeline. See, Fouquet died in 1680, which is well before the masked prisoner was ever moved to St. Marguerite or the Bastille. Which brings us to the man widely accepted by historians today as the true face behind the mask, Eustache Dogger. So the crucial point is how perfectly this rather obscure figure aligns with the cold, hard facts. Eustache Dogger was arrested in 1669 for an unknown crime. He was a simple valet, and not just any valet, but he likely served Nicolas Fouquet himself. He was held at Pignerol, and get this, every single time the guard Saint Mars was promoted and moved to a new fortress, Dogger was transferred right alongside him, matching the exact timeline perfectly. Now, you might be wondering, why the extreme secrecy for a lowly servant? Well, in a world of absolute monarchy, a valet to a powerful, corrupt official like Fouquet would have had intimate access to incredibly dangerous court secrets. He simply knew too much to be let go. But perhaps he was deemed just a bit too insignificant to officially execute, resulting in this bizarre, lifelong silencing. It leaves us with a truly fascinating reflection. How did a simple valet, wearing a basic velvet sun mask during prison transfers, somehow transform in the public eye into a royal prince locked in a horrifying iron contraption? It really shows us the immense power of political tension when it's combined with brilliant storytelling. I mean, think about it. A state secret created a rumor.
The rumor was weaponized for war, a philosopher exaggerated it for a political statement, and finally, a novelist turned it into a blockbuster myth. So the next time you hear a massive historical legend, I want you to ask yourself, what mundane yet potentially dangerous truth might be hiding right behind the mask? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you know.